Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. I'm Meg McNamara. I'm the Residency Program Director, and I'm here on behalf of Dr. Hirsch, our department chair, who's away at a conference this week, and Dr. Sandrayan Van Schaik, who's our Vice Chair of Education, and she is also engaged with another commitment at this time. So it is my pleasure to be here to welcome you to Grand Rounds this week. And as we begin, I'm going to start with the UCSF land acknowledgement. We would like to acknowledge the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the Ramaytush Ohlone elders, past, present, and future, who call this place, the land that UCSF sits upon, their home. We are proud to continue their tradition of coming together and growing as a community. We thank the Ramaytush Ohlone community for their stewardship and support, and we look forward to strengthening our ties as we continue our relationship of mutual respect and understanding. So it's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome one of our esteemed colleagues from orthopedics. Dr. Nirav Pandya is a pediatric orthopedic surgeon and sports medicine specialist within the UCSF Department of Orthopedic Surgery and Vice Chair of Pediatric Operations and Section Chief of the Division of Pediatric Orthopedics. Dr. Pandya joined the UCSF Department of Orthopedic Surgery in 2012. His areas of interest include sports medicine, arthroscopy, and pediatric trauma, as well as general pediatric orthopedics. Originally from Chicago, Dr. Pandya received his undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago, where he was elected to the Phi Beta Kappa Honor Society. And while at the University of Chicago, Dr. Pandya was a member of the track and field team and was elected captain his senior year. He remains one of the top 10 triple jumpers in the school's history. He then received his medical degree from the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. And while in medical school, he served as an assistant coach for the University of Chicago track and field team, coaching several national qualifiers in the long and triple jump. Dr. Pandya went on to complete orthopedic surgery residency at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia and served as academic chief resident his final year and was the recipient of the DeForest Willard Award for Outstanding Performance. His fellowship in pediatric orthopedic surgery was at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego, where he was awarded the Lena Sefton Clark Endowed Fellowship Award and received further training in general pediatric orthopedics, sports medicine, and hip preservation surgery. Dr. Pandya has authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications, multiple book chapters, and speaks regularly at national conferences, and is the host of one of the UCSF podcasts here called Perspectives on Sports Medicine that is broadcast for over 6 to 8 weeks at the part that he co-hosts for our UCSF and community of learners. And I know Dr. Pandya is very humble and said, you need not include all of those accolades, but I think that we're all very delighted that you're here today and we look forward to learning from you. Thank you.
Great, thanks everyone for coming. Let me just advance the slide here. So what I'll be talking about is a topic that's very dear to my heart, being a pediatric orthopedic surgeon and someone who does sports medicine, is talking about youth sports. And I think it's really important to understand where we are in terms of youth sports culture, what we see in terms of how kids are participating, what the injury risk is, and what does it mean for future performance. And I think this is less about the logistics of how do you diagnose someone with an ACL tear? What do you do for little league shoulder? But more about the culture that these kids are playing with. What are some of the problems with youth sports culture and how we can counsel parents and families, not necessarily in our office, but also just out on the sidelines or in our social gatherings, because this will come up a lot. So in terms of the objectives of this talk, and I'll leave a significant amount of time if people have questions at the end, is number one, understand the current youth sports epidemiology, because I think that's really important, is understanding where kids are playing sports. It's different than a lot of us did when we were growing up, and understanding what the risks of this participation is. What are some of the things that we see with single sport participation, which is what a lot of kids are participating in? And then finally, most importantly, with all this data, is really counsel parents about the long-term performance implications of single sport participation, both from an injury perspective and what it means, which is what a lot of parents will gravitate onto in terms of what it means for the performance and what it means for them longitudinally. So this was about 5-6 years ago. There was this article in the New York Times about how sport training has really changed, where usually kids who are kind of engaging in intensive training, getting private coaches, et cetera, started really in late high school or early college. And what we've seen now is that you see kids at age 1, age 2, age 3 engaging in very sport specific training. So as opposed to kids just going to the playground or just being in a play group where maybe they're playing soccer one day and they're playing baseball another day, these kids are in intensive year-round training starting at age 2 or age 3. And this is where the problem starts, is that parents are engaging their kids in this sports culture that is basically promoting skill development rather than healthy lifestyle at a very, very young age. And if you look at where kids are playing sports right now, there's about 5.5 million children who are playing in-school sports, but the 30 million children are playing out-of-school sports. So where kids are getting their sports participation has changed drastically. Whereas where many of us were in school, we were either getting most of our sports participation from, junior high, high school sports or through PE programs or kind of more school-based programs. Now that's shifted, where private entities where you're actually paying them money are basically driving youth sports participations for our youth. And that's where the problem starts. And at the same time, even though there are these private options, and we'll talk about at the end of the talk some of the disparities that are happening because of this, there's also been a drop in terms of school-based funding for physical education. So the vast majority of scholars in this room had PE every single day growing up. That's only about a quarter of all high school students right now who participate in daily PE classes. So once again, where kids are getting their sports activity level, if they can't afford it, they're not getting it at school. And even school-based programming, even not PE, but school-based teams are dropping even more. So it's a problem in terms of how kids are getting their participation and where they're participating in it. So the problem really is you have one group of kids who have access or have the money, and we'll talk about the money part a little bit later, to private sports, to club sports, to all the travel sports culture, and they're getting injured, they're getting burnt out, they're getting all the problems that come with specialization. And then we have another group of kids we don't talk about enough who don't have access to athletic activity because their parents can't afford private sports. They're not getting it in school. So then they get all the other problems of obesity, mental health issues, et cetera, for not being active. So even though a lot of this talk will concentrate on the helicopter parents, single sport specializing, playing 20 hours a week, we also have to think about the other group of kids who are being left out of playing sports because they don't have access to this due to money issues, where they're located, being in quote unquote sports deserts, where there aren't recreational or easily accessible options for kids to play sports. So the question really comes, what's different now? Many of us played sports. It was a big deal to play multiple sports in high school. Any of you have letter jackets? Raise a hands. Letter, like that was like a big thing. You played 3 sports. Now, no one wants to play for their high school team. So where did the shift happen? And part of it has to do with social media. Part of it has to do with money. Part of it has to do with the cost of college. So we'll kind of break that down a little bit so we can kind of get at the root of what's driving this. So, I'm originally from Chicago. And one of I consider Stephen Curry aside, Michael Jordan's still the best, one of the best basketball players of all time. And in the middle of his career, for various reasons, he just shifted over to playing baseball. No one seemed to really be concerned about it. Here's this great athlete going over to play a multiple sport. And now everyone's concentrating on just playing one sport in the LeBron James era that I talk about. So what has shifted where a major league baseball player, can also have had this great NBA career, and why has that shift occurred? And you have to look partly at what's being promoted in the media, where you basically take these stories of kids who have dedicated their life to playing sports at age 4, 5, and 6. I call it the Tiger Woods phenomena. And they're being promoted and being shown as this is the way to succeed in terms of sports, and kids and parents are taking that. At the same time, one of the things that needs to be taken consideration as well, too, is some of the changes that have been made in terms of kids and young athletes being able to actually make money off their name, image, and likeness. So take a step back, if you're not familiar with college sports, is that, as we all know, universities make a lot of money off their collegiate athletes. You look at these big football and basketball programs, these kids play, they barely get enough scholarship money, but the universities profit off it. Now, due to some legal rulings that have occurred, now athletes can actually make money off themselves, which they couldn't before. So they can get sponsorship deals from restaurants or car dealerships, et cetera. And this is also trickling down to the high school level. So now you're seeing families, and I have high school and even some junior high families coming in who are saying, look, my child can now make money off their athletic performance. And even though they may not necessarily get professional or may not even get a scholarship. So now there's even a bigger drive to say, look, my kid has to be really, really good at basketball or really good at baseball, because there's this earning potential that has opened up. So not only do we see increasing costs for college in general, but now there's this potential carrot out there that parents can potentially and kids can profit off of athletic performance. So this is all driving this culture of kids needing to specialize and be really good at sports, when in fact, and we'll show the data, this drive towards specialization is actually worsening their performance and not necessarily leading them to actually have more financial benefit. So taking a step back in clinic, the clinical part of things is actually pretty easy. yes, it's traumatic for a 10, 11, 12-year-old to get an ACL tear, but describing why it's important, what the surgery is going to be, what the postoperative protocol, that's the easy part. It's the non-clinical part that's very, very different because of all these financial considerations and the drive to get better. The social, the emotional part, the coaches that come into clinic with the kids, the parents, all these people who are involved in the decision-making process, that's the hard part. And I always like to say, when you look at professional athletes, people say, why, when Steph Curry has an ankle injury or he dislocates his shoulder, why are they holding him out longer than he should, even though it costs the Golden State Warriors millions of dollars with him not playing, but he's treated with extreme caution because they have the best interest, for the most part, of these athletes in terms of having to perform for a long period of time. But I'll get this youth athlete in who really the only downside of him not playing is that he just takes a couple weeks off. But the parents feel that if he doesn't play, he's going to lose out on the scholarship, which doesn't really exist, as we'll talk about, and they're treated with no caution. So I think we get this professional mindset coming into our clinics, and that leads to problems down the roads in terms of injury risk and sport dropout. So what we're seeing from a clinical standpoint in this culture is we're seeing kids specializing, and what the specialization has led from a clinical standpoint is they're seeing an increased number of kids getting sporting injuries under the age of 14. Now, when I was playing sports, I remember one or two kids who maybe had some sort of injury, maybe some quote unquote sprained their knee, they broke their wrist. But now we're seeing middle school kids frequently come in with their second ACL injury. They're coming in for a second meniscus surgery. It's just common, and it's not, unfrequent for a kid to come in and say, look, my 12-year-old friend tore their ACL, so I already know the postoperative protocol. What graft do you want? What graft are you going to use on me? So the knowledge of injuries, which are just adult pattern injuries, is increasing because it's becoming more and more frequent. And we have kids who are still growing. They're not resting. They're not training properly. And as a result, we see these ACL injuries. We see Tommy John injuries. We see stress fractures. So that's a clinical manifestation of what we're seeing. So to give you an example of kind of youth sports culture and kind of this drive to push, this was a survey that was done of 200 youth baseball pitchers. And this was in the New York area. And they basically just asked kids, like, do you have pain while you're throwing? And 75% of them said they had pain while throwing. 80% of them had pain the day after. And this is the troubling part, is 50% of them were encouraged to stay in the game even when they had discomfort. So this kind of exemplifies, who's driving this youth sports culture. And you have coaches and parents who are not necessarily trained or understand the data, are basically saying, push, push, push. When I played sports, I pushed through the pain, et cetera. It's a different culture right now, and it's not the best things for their body. Another great statistic is that when we look at youth ACL tears, there's been a 400% increase in them over the past decade. And this is directly linked to sports specialization. Kids tear their ACLs because they're training in a way that's not appropriate. They're getting ACL tears because they're fatigued. So once again, this is a reflection of the culture that these kids are playing in. Now, if you really ask me where I feel the root of the issue, where this is getting driven from, is really the cost of college. And this is when you ask parents, why do you have your kids specialize at a young age? Why you're getting all these private training? Why are you doing all these things? And a lot of them parents are saying, look, I want my kid to get a scholarship. I want them to get in college to succeed in sports. And this is the general average amount that parents will spend over 4 years for college, just $200,000. Some estimate this is going to be even doubled over the next 5 to 10 years. So there is a financial burden on parents, and the way they feel that they can get their kids to the next level is to get them a scholarship or get them entrance into college. So what has happened as a result is a lot of people have adopted the 10,000 hour rule that was basically proposed by Erickson, who said that if you want to become an expert in something, you have to practice 10,000 hours in that specialized field, which has obviously been debunked in multiple different areas. The parents grasp onto this and say, look, if I want my kid to be a good baseball player, they have to start just playing baseball at age 8, which is false. But as a result, they're latching onto this because they feel that's the way that they can get their kids to the next level. So as a result, what we have is kids playing year round in a single sport at the exclusion of other sports. So part of this is parental driven. Part of it's also driven by the club. So many of you, if you have young kids who play sports, it's really, really difficult for them to just basically play in the fall and then say, hey, I'm going to take a break off for 3 months and then play again in the spring. Because what ends up happening is then if you're not doing winter training, then the club's going to drop you. Or if you're not there every single practice, they're not going to play you. So not only, even as parents, we want to tell our kids, look, take time off, do something else. You don't have to specialize. The systems inherent in what kids want to actually do don't allow that. And for a lot of kids, they say, look, all right, I'm not going to necessarily play for this competitive team, but then there isn't another option out there for them. There's not a school-based program. There's not a recreational program. So either they have to go into this culture of year-round training and then get injured, or simply not play a sport, which then has its negative detriments as well too. And then you combine this whole culture with the business of youth sports, with the money that's involved with it, and you get a problem. And youth sports have become a $15.3 billion industry. So we basically turned over the health of our young children to entities which are basically just concerned with making money and promoting this dream of kids making it to the next level by being part of their club or being part of their professional training, when in fact that necessarily is not true. And you'll see stuff like this. And this was even 10 years ago, where basically there are these showcases where kids can show up and basically pitch a lot or play soccer a lot, where they'll potentially get noticed by a college coach and they'll say, look, well, 35 were advertised as coming, but actually 40 showed up. So pay us $500 every day to come play, or pay us $10,000 to come down for 2 weeks down to Florida to showcase your baseball talent. So all these various things are inherent in them basically generating money. And as a result, what ends up happening is free play is no longer encouraged. So you just don't see kids outside playing anymore, right? If you go to your park, you'll usually say like the 1, 2, 3-year-olds, but when was the last time you saw a bunch of 10-year-olds just in the park playing a pickup game of football or just playing pickup basketball? You just don't see it, because a lot of parents don't see that doesn't have a goal for them. Like if you're playing pickup basketball, who's going to be watching? Maybe you'll get injured, even though you probably won't. What's the potential goal for it? So sports become goal driven as opposed to just participating in it because it's beneficial for your body. There was a great thing done by ESPN. It was a documentary a couple of years ago talking about how playground basketball is dying. You just don't see, number one, playgrounds out there, and you don't see kids playing. And emblematic of this, I asked my kid, one of my patients one time, I said, look, why don't you just play on the weekend? Like go out to the park, play a game, et cetera. And he told me, quote, it's not good for my brand. Okay. So you can see how, it's kind of shifting around where kids are thinking, at this young age about how can I promote myself to make money down the road, as opposed to just engaging in sports because it's the right thing to do. So what a lot of parents don't hear are the actual statistics of who's going to make it to the next level. So if there's a couple things that you remember from this talk, I think it's important to remember these statistics, because a lot of parents will come in and they'll say, look, everyone makes it professionally, everyone makes it collegiately, and everyone gets a big scholarship. Everyone has a neighbor who made it, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't actually know the exact statistics about how many people make it to the next level. The clubs won't tell you this. It's not on the website. So when parents hear this data, that really kind of sometimes will give them pause and say, is it worth it for my kid to go into this culture when the chance of them actually making it to the next level is very, very low? So if you actually look at the number of athletes, if you take all high school athletes in general and how many of them actually make it professionally, it's only 0.006%. Very, very small. The chance of someone making it there is relatively low. And I usually tell them, if you're in my clinic, that chance is probably even lower. If you're seeing an orthopedic surgeon, you're probably going to be injured. Okay. So that chance is very low. And some parents will say, okay, that's fine. My kid's not going to make it professionally. They're going to go play collegiately. The chance of actually making it collegially and getting a college scholarship is only 2%. So that chance is even lower. And then even if you get that college scholarship, the average amount over 4 years is $11,000. Okay. So if you imagine 3 years of playing travel soccer, you've already spent more money than you would actually get for that college scholarship. Okay. So parents don't know that. They think everyone's going to get a full ride, which is not the case. And if you actually look at the only sports that actually give full rides in the NCAA, these are only sports that do it. So it's football, men's and women's basketball, gymnastics, volleyball, and tennis. The two sports you don't see on here, which are the biggest kind of culprits of year-round specialization, baseball and soccer. Okay. Those are the biggest things around here. You're not going to get a full scholarship because they don't exist. Okay. They can get partial scholarships, but not a full scholarship. So once again, parents don't know those numbers. And even if they get there, they're going to be getting $11,000 over 4 years for the most part. Okay. And if you look at the actual statistics, I always joke with people, your best chance to make it, to make it to the next level is become a men's ice hockey player. Okay. It's about 11% because no one plays ice hockey. But once again, the numbers are really, really low for high school athletes to make it to the next level, but you don't hear that. You don't hear that data. And it's our role as clinicians to let them know those statistics so they understand what the chances of them going there are. But what is happening is that because of this culture, you're getting 70% of kids by age 13 dropping out of youth sports. That's crazy. They're not even in high school yet. And I say my kids play soccer. And, right at this age, my son's 13, a lot of kids have actually stopped. They're done. He has a bunch of friends who played soccer when they were 9, 10, 11, who said, I'm done. I'm not going to play soccer anymore. These kids are retiring from competitive sports in middle school, which is just crazy. If you look at the data in terms of what they're citing, they're saying the reasons are adults, coaches, and parents. It's us in this room. And in my clinic, a lot of times when I have kids come in and they've had surgery or they're coming in for an overuse injury, and I'll have the parents step aside or they go to the bathroom, and the kids get it. The kids understand what it's doing to their bodies, but they're afraid to tell their parents that they're not enjoying it anymore. And they're getting burnt out because of this culture that's being driven by adults. So I encourage you, if you have these kids in their clinic, and just like when you're doing other kind of more private type, kind of interviews with the kids, if they're older, have the parents step out and ask the kids if they're actually enjoying what they're doing. We spend a lot of time trying to get this treatment plan for their overuse injury or how to return them to sport, a lot of times the kids aren't enjoying it. So get that information out, and then you can use that information with the parents to be like, look, ask your kid if they're enjoying it. Maybe you need to change the way they're participating, find a different club. Because a lot of times the kids understand the stress they're feeling, the discomfort, and need to be kind of supported in that endeavor with the parents and coaches. So we pretty much can see from the data that single sport specialization doesn't lead to an athletic scholarship. But what it does lead to is burnout. It leads to injury, which we'll talk about. It leads to isolation as well, too. You can imagine if your only social group are those 10 kids that you're playing travel basketball with year in and year out, these kids aren't like going to stuff after school. They're not going to the dances. They're not going to hang out with their friends. Because if any of you have kids who are playing travel sports, that's your life all the time, So they're basically engaging in a smaller peer group, and then it leads to poor adult health, which we'll talk about as well too. So even with all that data, I'll share that with parents. Some will say, you know what? I'm willing to take that risk if my kid can be that 0.006%. Okay. So what we have to show them is then the data that actually shows that's not the case as well too. So we'll show you some data in terms of sports specialization and pro performance. And then it's also important for parents to understand what are the long-term adult health implications and really is it worth the risk? So let's look at short-term athletic performance. So you have that middle school kid who's in there, who's made the decision to play year-round sports. They're going to play gymnastics. They're going to do soccer. They're going to do baseball. What's the impact on their immediate health? So there are tons of studies. If you PubMed sports specialization, you're going to find lots and lots of papers now that kind of injury risk. 10 years ago, there was only a couple of reviews, but now there's tons of data out there. So it's very, very clear. And most parents will understand that, but they don't think that their kid's going to be the one that gets injured. The one study that, and you may have heard this, I think the best counseling you can give to parents, because a lot of times they'll ask, well, how much organized sports is appropriate for my kid to play? Common question they'll ask. And what a lot of these studies have shown is that the number of hours of organized sports your child should play per week is equal to their age. So if you're a 10-year-old, they should be doing 10 hours a week. If they're 6, they should be doing 6 hours a week. There have been studies that have shown that your injury risk exponentially increases when you get past that. Okay. Now, the important thing to note is that also includes a little bit of free play they may be doing in their backyard as well, too. So the baseball player may be doing, well, I'm only doing 8 hours a week, but then I go out and pitch in my backyard for an hour and a half. So it's really important for parents to kind of monitor how many hours they're playing per week. But that's a kind of a good benchmark in terms of how much organized activity they should be doing. And that's where that injury risk comes from. Now, if we look at some of the more kind of earlier studies that looked at specialization, this was a study that was done early in Germany, and they found that the more diversified you were in your sports training early and middle adolescence, you actually had better athletic performance. Because you can imagine if you're doing basketball, you're doing baseball, you're doing soccer, the ability to transfer through multiple different kind of motor activities makes you better in terms of actual athletic ability as measured by certain motor tasks. This was a study that was done in Europe as well, too, where they looked at about 700 boys who were younger, kind of in that late elementary school, early middle school. They found that those who played multiple sports did better in terms of their general motor skills, in terms of jumping, gross motor coordination, et cetera. So if you're looking at even short term, if you're playing multiple sports, you're actually going to be better than specializing. If we look at short-term sport dropout, this was a study that looked at athletic performance in Germany, found that the younger at the age at which you specialize, the earlier you're going to drop out of sports. So once again, if you're at 6, you're 7 or 8, and you're already making the decision to play travel sports and year round, you're going to probably drop out when you're 11, 12, or 13. And then this is part of the issue with money, which we'll talk about as well too. If you have a higher socioeconomic status, which means that you can afford club sports, you're more likely to have overuse injuries and drop out as well too. So part of this is an access issue as well, is that if you have access to this culture, and as a result of it, you're going to drop out because that culture is promoting you to specialize. And if you look at high school kids and look at what happens in terms of college, you'll find that the vast majority of kids who actually play collegiate sports actually specialize at a later age. And this was a study that was done at UCLA. We've also seen this study also transferred over to other sports, other schools on the East Coast as well too, that kids who play Division I sports are those who specialize much later than those who specialize early. So when you're counseling parents, I tell them, look, what's the best thing you can do to improve their athletic performance and keep them injury-free is to have them specialize at a much later age or not specialize at all. And this was another study as well, too, that was done at Jefferson that looked at age of specialization and found that kids who dropped out very early were the ones who specialized at a much younger age. And even in things like hockey, track and field, you see the same thing hold true. Now, where a lot of the data, which parents don't know, is how does it impact midterm athletic performance? So what this means is, how does sports specialization correlate with the ability to perform in the pros, right? Because there's going to be that subset of parents who are going to come in and say, I'm going to risk it. I know all these short-term risks. I know my kid might get an ACL tear, et cetera, but this is the way that I think they need to get professionally. And the first thing I always tell them is that if you're specializing, you're going to get injured. And the number one way you're not going to make it to the next level is you're injured. But even with that, some parents are still going to roll the dice. So what does the data actually show when you look at professional data? So we did this study a couple of years back looking at NBA players. Okay, and I'll kind of go through each major professional league. We found that if you looked at first round draft picks, so these were the elite of the elite NBA players, those who played multiple sports in high school were actually had longer NBA careers, they had fewer major injuries, and they actually had better statistical performance. So once again, if you're going to specialize, if you are going to be that lucky group that's going to go professionally, it's probably better for you to specialize, to not specialize in your sport. It's better to play multiple sports. If we look at the NFL, okay, the vast majority of people who actually are invited to the NFL Combine, which is basically kind of the pre-draft area where basically individuals who are going to make it to the next level are basically evaluated. 88% of NFL Combine invitees play multiple sports. Okay, so once again, multiple sports good for NFL and NBA. If you look at Major League Baseball, okay, this is a study that was done looking at Major League Baseball players. We found, not we, but in general, the community found that statistically significant higher rate of serious injury during a baseball player's pro career in those who specialize early. In most Major League pitchers, actually, Major League players said that you don't need to specialize in order to make it to the next level. So now we've got NBA data, we've got NFL data, we've got MLB data. If you actually look more kind of discreetly at MLB data, what sports specialization has actually done is not improve performance. All it's done is shifted when these athletes peak. So as opposed to peaking in age 30, they're peaking at age 24 because their body is just worn down. So as a result, you're basically not improving performance. You're basically getting these kids injured earlier. And some of them are actually getting injured even before they make it to that next level. And even when you look at individual sports like track and field, same sort of thing is holding true. You see, look at kids who are basically performing at an elite level at the junior high and high school level, and then they disappear when you get to the professional level because they've gotten injured or they've dropped out. So once again, even in the individual sports, specializing in early age doesn't hold true. And even when you look at human performance, because then you're going to have some parents will say, look, this is going to improve my performance. You know, like they need to specialize to actually discreetly do better in some of these metrics. If you look at the 100-meter time from pre-specialization areas to post-specialization area, hasn't necessarily increased that much. And if you kind of throw out Usain Bolt, who has the 100-meter record, everyone else, the 100-meter time hasn't necessarily increased. You look at the mile time, it stayed the same. If you look at the marathon, now there has been a little bit of drop recently, but in general, there hasn't been that big of a drop in the mile time. Most of that the marathon timing increase has been due to shoe wear, not necessarily specialization. The long jump record is still the same from when Bob Beamon did it. The home run record, whether you believe in steroids or not, is, that played a role in it. Still the same as strikeout. So all these markers that we use of kind of athletic performance haven't changed at all based on specialization. So once again, what is it really doing? It's honestly just injuring kids and having them drop out of sports. It's not letting them get to an elite level. It's not letting them have a more fulfilling adult athletic career. So based on this professional data, even for the elite of the elite athletic performance, specialization is not necessary. If anything, peak performance may be occurring earlier for certain sports, but actual athletic performance is not improving. So once again, this is all important data. And sometimes the professional data is what the parents need to hear, even when you share with them the NCAA data, the scholarship data, et cetera. And I think most importantly, how does this all affect long-term health? So we talk about dropout. What does it mean for a 13-year-old to drop out of sports? And kind of being in practice now 10, 11 years, I've got a cohort of patients who are now in their late 20s, early 30s. We're kind of part of the initial wave of kind of sports specialization culture. And these individuals, if they've had surgery, are now getting arthritis. They're not as active. They're getting obesity because they're just done. They don't want to participate in sports. So really the goal of sports for me has always been, it keeps you healthy and active for your entire life. So you want to run, you want to play recreational sports, but if you have such a bad taste in your mouth from it, or you've gotten injured so severely, then we're doing a disservice to all the adult internal medicine doctors and pulmonary doctors, et cetera, who are now dealing with the burdens of that when people get in their 30s and 40s because they're not healthy and active anymore. And at the same point, we're not even giving them a healthy alternative because we're not promoting the importance of school-based programming or physical education, which can keep kids healthy and active and introduce them to a lot of these healthy lifestyles. So when we look at how physically active high school students are, this is a group of students who are either, number one, not active because of screen time and all the other things, but also this cohort of students who have dropped out of sport as well, too. We're seeing an increasing percentage of kids who just aren't meeting basic physical activity requirements. Result, you would say, well, We're creating this specialization culture. Shouldn't everyone be getting fitter and healthier? But they're not. We're seeing rates of obesity. We're seeing increased rates of diabetes. We're seeing increased rates of coronary artery disease, these things. So all these things that we would hopefully be getting better with this ultra competitive culture is not improving when we map this out over the next 15 to 20 years. So we're basically creating this generation of children who have increased risk of cardiovascular disease. They're dropping out of sport. They have barriers to participation, which we'll talk about. And they're also dealing with the orthopedic manifestations of having an ACL tear at age 10, 11, or 12. So we're just not doing our kids, doing a service to them by having them in this culture. So in general, I think we need to take a step back and be very basic. Kids should be healthy and active for 60 minutes a day in a non-organized setting. Okay. So that means they can go out and run, they can ride their bike, they can go to the playground, right? So I tell parents, ask, what's the best thing for my kid to do when they're 6, 7, or 8? Go to the playground. It's not structured. They're working on core strength. They're working on balance. They're working on all the things that are important to prevent injury. And there's not really a goal associated with it, right? No one's going to win at the playground unless you're playing some sort of game. But it's important just to go out there and work on those basic things that get lost when all you're doing is learning how to kick a soccer ball, how good to do your gymnastics routine. You just need to go out there and play and just enjoy yourself, which is the best way to promote it. And as a result, we'll hopefully decrease all the injuries that we're seeing in our clinic and not have those manifestations. We know that if you have an ACL tear, your rate of arthritis, regardless of whether you get it fixed or not, is going to increase. We know that if you have a meniscus tear at age 12 and then again at 16, all these things are going to burden our healthcare system down the road. And we're seeing these cohort of kind of specialization kids, as I like to tell tell parents, who are then now going to be start getting in their 40s and 50s, those knee replacements, being less active, et cetera, which will burden the healthcare system. So I want to shift gears a little bit now in the last 15 minutes. And we've talked about specialization and injury risk and problems with culture, but talk about some of the disparities that result out of this culture in terms of how we're treating them and what's happening to kids kind of from that standpoint. So I brought the slide up in terms of the business of youth sports, and it's become a $15.3 billion industry. But the problem is that with this culture right now, there are tons and tons of families, particularly in a lot of the communities that we serve in my clinic in Oakland or that you see over here as well too, that just don't have access to sports because of the sheer amount of money that it takes to be able to actually play. So when you look at the actual data, and this was a study that was done by TD Ameritrade, they found that 63% of parents will pay between $100 to $500 per month, with about 20% paying $12,000 a year. Okay. That's a significant amount of money that goes to being able to participate in youth sports. You can imagine for a lot of the population that we take care of, particularly those who are, have public insurance or have no insurance, you can't afford that. It's just impossible for even middle-class families to afford that. And that doesn't even take into account some of the fees that don't go into this. It's the time lost from work. It's the time the parents can say, look, I have to leave work early on Friday because I have to take my kid to Reno to play in a soccer tournament. Or, they're tired or they get sick, et cetera, or even related to medical expenses. Like that's a lot of money. And kids are left out of that. And as we talked about, that cost per year is more than the average scholarship amount. So not only are middle-class families from a financial standpoint losing money because of this, there are a whole group of kids who can't even get access to sports. And that doesn't even account for the expenses from injuries. And if you look at some data, it suggests that an ACL tear in a 13 or 14-year-old has an economic impact of over $100,000 to $150,000 on the family from time missed from work, for physical therapy expenses, for transportation expenses, et cetera. And then if you actually look at where these scholarships are actually going, right? The goal of scholarships is to basically, from my standpoint, is to open opportunities for families who don't have the means or have been historically disenfranchised from having access to things that allow them to get that next step towards college. If you actually look at where the scholarships are going, it's actually going to individuals who have a higher socioeconomic status than the average student, are less likely to be first-generation college students. Because how are scholarships basically awarded? Well, kids have to be part of this culture, so they have to be playing on travel teams because high school teams just aren't existing or aren't promoted as much. And then they have to go to these showcases, which involve money and travel, and that's where college coaches go. So if you can't afford it, you can't play on that travel team. Or the other aspect that you're looking at is that even though there might be a travel team that you can afford, it's 35 miles away from where you live because there aren't facilities for these kids to play. So your parents can't get to it. You're not even going to get that chance at that, $11,000 scholarship. So even the scholarships are going to the wrong individuals right now. It's going to the kids who can actually afford to be part of this youth sports culture and kind of this train of kind of getting a scholarship because you can afford it. A great organization that I refer you to for a lot of this data is called Project Play, the Aspen Institute. You type that in, they have great information. They do a lot of work in the Oakland community, in the East Bay as well too, but they have great statistics for kind of this disparity in terms of youth sports. But if you kind of look a little bit more closely in their data, for those kids who are definitely historically disenfranchised, whose families are making less than $25,000 a year, only about a third of them are actually able to play some degree of team sports. But if you look at families who are over $100,000, almost 70% of them participating. So that's a huge participation disparity. Even though there are issues with the culture of what they'd be participating, we do want kids to have some access to sports, even though we have to change that culture. But that's a huge barrier in terms of participation and ability to participate because of the financial barriers. And this is another study that was done by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Only a quarter of middle and high school students who are from these lower income brackets can actually participate in youth sports. So once again, we're starting this bigger and bigger gap in terms of participation. Yes, kids are getting injured if are able to participate, but there's no other access points for kids to be able to play sports because they don't have the recreational funding, they don't have the school-based funding, and they're being left out. We did this survey of our patients at the East Bay to basically look at how much of a burden it was for families. And we found, not surprisingly, even here in the East Bay, where there is a lot of money and a lot of different options, that a lot of families felt the burden or the stress of playing single sports or being able to access youth sports. So once again, it happens in our backyards, and we need to be able to counsel parents and families and change the culture so they're more accessible options for our families. And finally, when we look at it from an injury perspective, access and this culture, which is promoting these injuries, becomes a lot more complex as well, too. So when we look at it from a clinical standpoint, we're seeing this culture that's increasing injuries. So even if a kid who's from a lower socioeconomic bracket somehow gets access to youth sports, or they get basically a scholarship, which some clubs do for kids to play sports, they're getting injured more often. But what does that mean in terms of the back end, in terms of access? What does it mean to have an ACL tear when you have Medi-Cal? What does it mean if you don't have insurance, you have a meniscus tear, you have a shoulder dislocation, because you've been participating in this youth sports culture? So there's a lot of data that demonstrates disparities that exist because of that. So if we look at pediatric ACL patients, those who are publicly insured versus those who are privately insured are more likely to have a treatment delay. They're more likely to get a meniscus injury. And if they do get surgery, they're more likely to get postoperative stiffness. So that's great. You played sports, you're going in this culture, but now you tore your ACL. So we're basically allowing them to get access to it. And then they're trying to navigate the sports injuries. So number one, there's, first of all, a limited number of providers who'll see pediatric ACL injuries. And then you have, public insurance. And we're doing a study right now, which we're going to publish, where we just cold called orthopedic offices and said, hey, I'm a 13-year-old with an ACL tear. I have Medi-Cal. And then we called them again and said, you had private insurance. And we called them again in Spanish. You can imagine English-speaking private pay patients will immediately get an appointment. If you're at a private office, you have Medi-Cal, or you're Spanish-speaking, suddenly that appointment didn't exist. Okay. So you could see that out in the community, if they can't access UC or access academic center, there are limited ways for them to actually get access to care. What ends up happening with these kids who have an ACL tear is that if you've seen them, they start feeling a little bit better in a couple of weeks. And, they're like, okay, I'm going to go play sports and I'll have instability episodes. And they come into our clinic 2 years later with horrible meniscus tears, degeneration in their knee. They've been in and out of sports because their knee hasn't been feeling good. And then suddenly all the other secondary issues come as a result of that. They have mental health issues. They're having obesity. They're having inability to work. So all these things then play a role in how their family is functioning, just because they got an ACL tear, and there are all these systemic issues that are preventing them from getting care for that injury. This was another study that looked at delay in terms of pediatric ACL surgery. And they found that individuals who are publicly insured or from a lower socioeconomic bracket had to wait 2.3 months more in terms of getting treatment. So what does that mean? Well, number one, that increases your risk of having a meniscus tear. Number two, it increases your risk of having more cartilage degeneration. So even though an ACL tear is not an emergency, walking around with an unstable knee, or not having someone even tell you tore your ACL, and you try to get back to sports, is problematic. And even when you look at kind of look at this more in a subset way in terms of race as well too, we see the same things happen. You have more treatment delays. They have more severe injuries at the time of surgery. They get less physical therapy. So even if they get the injury, they're getting one physical therapy visit a month as opposed to the 20 that someone's getting with private insurance. And then even if they get fixed, they have poor functional outcomes down the road. And as I mentioned, there have been other studies that have basically looked at access to care and found the same thing. If you have Medi-Cal, you have Medicaid, et cetera, you're just not going to get the care that if you had private insurance. And we actually said, okay, well, let's look at this in our own safety net setting. We're insurer blind. Let's look and see how it looks when we look at our ACL patients. And we could found that even in our setting with no barriers in terms of, how we're treating patients, et cetera, patients with private insurance were able to obtain an MRI diagnosis 50% faster after their injury when we looked at our patients historically. Time from injury to ACL reconstruction was about a month quicker if you had a private insurance. And in general, everything went quicker. And part of the reason was just navigating the healthcare system. These kids get injured, it's harder to get a referral, harder to get MRI authorization. They need something from their primary care physician, et cetera. Everything just gets delayed. So we're doing a disservice to these kids by throwing them into this culture. And on the back end, when they do get injured, they're not getting the treatment they need. Same thing happens with meniscus injuries. So if you're public insurance or you're not insured, you're experiencing treatment delays. And if any of you had a meniscus tear, you know how painful that is. So if you're waiting 3 to 4 months to get your meniscus fixed or meniscus diagnosed, it's going to lead to dysfunction and lead to sport dropout. And that basically, we saw that even in our data here as well, too, in a safety net hospital where publicly insured families were getting their meniscus tears treated, diagnosed at a much later time point. We see it in shoulder instability as well, too. And this was our review of our data over here, is that for adolescent athletes who basically had public insurance, you can see how much longer it time to get everything done. An MRI, to get your diagnosis, get your surgical stabilization done. So we see this in every aspect of youth sports, is that it's leading to these increased injuries, and then it's leading to disparities in how these kids are get treated. So something that's really, really important. And the last thing we need to talk about is even how kids who are part of this culture are getting even little things like pain perceived. And we found that even in school settings, when you basically, individuals of color come in, the medical staff will treat their pain differently if they come in, if they're Hispanic, they're Black, as opposed to someone who's Caucasian, just different in terms of how they're being treated when they come in as a young athlete. Even for athletic training, which is a big thing in terms of how we treat kids who get these injuries. If you come from a private school in the area, you come from a school that has a good tax base and has a great public school, they're more likely to have athletic trainers to basically treat kids. Whereas a result, if you go to a public school, saying, East Oakland, they don't have an athletic trainer there. So these kids are trying to navigate the healthcare system without athletic trainers there. So there's a lot of disparities that exist at every level, even for things like concussions as well, too. Not just the ACL, the meniscus injuries, et cetera. This culture is set up for disparities at so many different levels. And even when they get injured, we're not treating them appropriately, even though we as clinicians want to. There's systemic issues in place. So number one, we need to change that culture so they're not getting injured. And number two, changing the structures that are set up in our hospitals so these kids can get access to care so they can be healthy and active into their adult life. So kind of the top 10 list, kind of summing it up and leaving some time for questions. Youth sports injuries at epidemic levels. We're seeing more and more of these injuries now. And specialization is associated with an injury risk. That's very, very clear. We know that from a short-term standpoint, athletic performance improves with playing multiple sports, not playing a single sport, okay? Midterm athletic performance comes with playing multiple sports. So if you want to make it professionally and you're able to avoid injury and you don't burn out, probably should be doing multiple sports. In sports specialization is not necessary for that elite performance, whether you look at NBA data, MLB data, NFL data, et cetera. Sports specialization leads to dropout. We want to keep our kids in there and not have them drop out at age 13. But the problem is there just aren't other avenues for other sports. So I can sit there and tell individuals that you had to play multiple sports or you shouldn't be in this kind of club sport-based culture. But we as clinicians and as parents and kind of people who take care of kids should advocate for recreational-based opportunities, advocate for school-based programming, or advocate for competitive programs that allow you to play multiple sports. And I think we need to shift the culture, and more organizations are helping to push that. But as we get kids who are getting injured at a young age, they're not able to participate in sports. We're seeing all the downstream negative health effects as a result. And those who continue to play and have these injuries will have an arthritic risk. So even more issues for adult orthopedic surgeons as these kids kind of get older and they're less likely to participate in sports. And it's important to understand that disparities exist. Kids don't have access to sports. When they get injured, there's disparities. And it's just, we need to change the culture in general so we can keep kids healthy and active until their adult ages. So that was a whirlwind of youth sports culture. We're going to leave some time in the last 10, 15 minutes here for questions if anyone has any questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Hey, I'm Susanna. I'm a Gen P. I see a lot of concussions with these kids who play like one sport. Is there any data where there is also like a increased risk of concussions with specialization, which is playing multiple sports?
There is, yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, sure, yeah. So the question is there increased concussion risk with playing single sport? So absolutely there is. So I think part of it is not necessarily a reflection of playing a single sport, but what they're doing when they're doing that single sport. So they're training more intensely and more professionally. And there's also part of it's also desire to hide symptoms as well too. So I do see that if you look at multi-sports participation, because they're less likely to be training that intensely, they're less likely to engage in activity that leads to concussion. And we also know that there's some association with fatigue and muscle breakdown that leads you to have a concussion. So a lot of kids, for soccer, for example, if they're fatigued, their muscles are breaking down, they're more likely to have an event that leads to a concussion. So absolutely, there's that association with that as well too. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting talk. If I may, I'd like to offer a counter opinion.
Sure.
You make a strong case that these single sports is the issue in relation to orthopedic injuries.
Yeah.
I'm a pediatric endocrinologist. These single sport athletes are usually the lowest risk of developing obesity. Indeed, our patients that come to us with severe problems with their hormones because of their intensive athleticism time spent in sport. Probably the last thing that they need is to have another sport to prevent you. So it may be good for orthopedic injuries. Other systems, I'm not sure it's as advantageous to add an additional sport. And generally speaking, those athletes that are at that level of competition are not the ones that we're concerned with get obese and have just want to offer that.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. No. So the question was a counterpoint, in terms of what we see orthopedically versus in an endocrine clinic. I agree. I think there is a little bit of a nuance to it as well too. I would say that in terms of part of it is also monitoring volume as well too. So I think that what ends up happening for a lot of these single sport athletes is, yes, if they're already playing 20 hours a week and then adding another sport on, makes that up to 30. I think that part of it is the volume as well too. So a kid can, if they're going to specialize in one sport, they stay below those volume recommendations, or playing multiple sports, but basically doing it in lieu of that training. So if they're doing 10 hours of soccer, doing 5 hours of soccer and 5 hours of basketball as well too. And I do agree that when you see that a lot of these kids, not an orthopedic standpoint, they are the kids who are fit, they're elite if they don't get that orthopedic issue. But we do know that eventually what may happen is that they're going to drop out just based on the data. So it definitely is, it's finding that balance of keeping them healthy and active within the confines of volume as well too. So not having them go over those volume recommendations. So people always ask, would you rather me play multiple sports and do 30 hours a week or play a single sport and do 10 hours a week? I would rather do single sport and 10 hours a week. The problem is that a lot of the specialization culture both has the high volume and all the associated risks as well too. Yeah. Great point.
So we have a few questions from the Zoom.
Sure.
Sure. So we have one of our trainees who asks, given the high level players are more likely to do multiple sports, is it more likely that the causation runs the opposite way, that the individuals who have that level of athleticism to succeed in multiple sports are more likely to be drafted?
Okay, yeah, so absolutely. So that's the counterpoint you do get a lot, is that the kids can play multiple sports because they're just naturally more talented. And that's the reason why they are able to do it. Even when they've kind of been more nuanced studies that have looked at, even when you control for kind of athletic performance or athletic ability, that even still your ability to make it to the next level is still heightened by playing multiple sports. So it's not just that the kids who are playing multiple sports are the best athletes. It also, if you look at control for those other factors in terms of athletic ability, it still holds true as well too. So
another person asks, what about the fact that if kids don't play club sports, then they will never make the high school team at a lot of the competitive high schools here in the city, and I'm sure elsewhere too. How do we balance not throwing them into expensive competitive club teams, but still ensure that they can have the benefits of playing high school sports along with the friendships, exercise, emotional health that it accompanies that?
No, that's a great question. And I agree. And that's part of the culture issue, that it's hard, is that part of it is advocating. There's not an easy, the next year answer. We have to, advocate with the high school coaches, advocate with community coaches to say, look, we can either change the volume of what these clubs are doing, or talking with the high school coaches and saying, look, like, in order to do the best thing for the athlete, we need to make sure that we're moderating their ability to do it. So I agree that it is hard for me to say, don't play club sports year round, don't do that, don't do all these other things, when in fact it's hard to basically extract yourself from it. So what we can do as clinicians is advocate and hope for culture change. And I've seen that. I've seen clubs in other areas start to understand this a lot more, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But on a day-to-day basis, it is hard because if you're not doing that, there aren't necessarily options out there for kids to say, look, okay, I'm going to be the kid who's not going to play club sports year round, but I want to play my high school. But then the high school coach, many times who is the club coach, can't, won't let me on the team. So I think us as clinicians just have to help to advocate for the culture shift and understand that there will be some navigating of those situations as they go along.
There's another question here, perhaps maybe almost a comment. Perhaps that increased school-based sports seems to be the silver bullet. And as a corollary to that, I'll say that as a parent of 3 kids who are now young adults, I was absolutely blown away by the pay-to-play culture in the city. And I'm wondering about what kind of concerted efforts there are being made to tap into the influence of professional athletes to get them to be the ones who are talking to the kids and their parents about this insane culture that's come up, because there's no incentive for the $15.3 billion business people who are doing it.
Absolutely. Great point. And several of us are kind of involved in advocacy for this. We've, you talk to most professional athletes, they totally agree. And, there are kind of scattered individuals out there who talk about it a lot more. I think where the biggest benefit is tapping into professional sports teams and them investing into the community to basically have more programs for kids. And it's not just here's $15 million and we'll build a court, right? It's about here's the facility, and then we're going to provide you the staff and the salaries for them to be there all the time. Because anyone can build a nice fancy court or soccer field, but then if there's no one there to kind of encourage the community. So I think it's the professional athletes speaking out about it more frequently, and then organizations that have the money providing the infrastructure. Because I think it's hard for, as much as we want to advocate for a public school, there is public schools, there's a lack of money, right? So can there be other recreational based programs out there? And some organizations, some areas have done that with soccer and football, but can we leverage professionals, teams, and their athletes to help create that change? Because I think that's where parents will listen to it, because those are the ones they feel that they need to aspire to be. But if those professional athletes are saying let's play multiple sports, or let's put money into this, that'll make the difference. Yeah. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.